Hello there, and welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. Together, we're going to be reading the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year. Today, we're reading Genesis 41:15 through 38. I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we'll discuss what we read after. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamed a dream, and none can solve it, and I have heard about you that you can understand a dream to solve it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, Not I. God will answer for Pharaoh's well-being. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, In my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and look, out of the Nile came up 7 cows, fat in flesh and fair in feature, and they grazed in the rushes. And look, another 7 cows came up after them, gaunt and very foul-featured and meager in flesh. I had not seen their like in all the land of Egypt for foulness. And the meager foul cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. And they were taken into their bellies, and you could not tell they had come into their bellies, for their looks were as foul as before. And I woke, and I saw in my dream, and look, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, full and goodly, and look, 7 shriveled, meager ears, blasted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the meager ears swallowed the 7 goodly ears, and I spoke to my soothsayers, and none could tell me the meaning. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one. What God is about to do, he has told Pharaoh. The 7 goodly cows are 7 years, and the 7 ears of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 meager and foul cows who came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 meager ears of grain blasted by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, what God is about to do, he has shown Pharaoh. Look, 7 years are coming of great plenty through all the land of Egypt, and 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. And you will not be able to tell there was plenty in the land because of that famine afterward, for it will be very grave. And the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh 2 times, this means that the thing has been fixed by God, and God is hastening to do it. And so, let Pharaoh look out for a discerning, wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Appoint overseers for the land, and muster the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty. Let them collect all the food of these good years that are coming, and let them pile up grain under Pharaoh's hand, food in the cities to keep under guard. And the food will be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish in the famine. And the thing seemed good in Pharaoh's eyes and in the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Could we find a man like him in whom is the Spirit of God? And that's the end of that. So, we have the conclusion of Pharaoh's dream here. And, let's see here. Yes, lots of 7s being used in these passages. We have a very smart audience out there. 7, of course, has a lot of significance in the Bible, the 7 days of the week. 7 has a sense of completeness often. So yes, lots of 7s, for sure. Then getting back to what I said yesterday, we have the concept that cognitive dissonance, and Google it if you don't know it. It's a good term to know. And that is that, again, you have the meager cows you wouldn't expect to overtake the stronger ones. And also, once they overtake them, they don't change, right? Whoever heard of absorbing something into yourself and it doesn't affect you at all? That's really weird, right? So there's just weird thing after weird thing on top of each other that doesn't really fit anything. So it really does demand a spiritual answer because it just flies in the face of common sense. And that's often how God works.
I have another translation issue with Robert Alter. And that's in the 34th verse.
Okay.
Most translations would probably say, take a 5th part of the land of Egypt. And look what he says.
He says the meaning of the verb himesh is disputed. It could be derived from hamesh, or amesh meaning 5, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And thus refer to a scheme of dividing the land into 5ths. But the same root is also used for the arming of deployment of troops, and the idea may be that Joseph is putting the whole country on footing in preparation. So that's why he goes that way. But he does comment in his notes that that's a possibility.
Okay.
There you go. Issue resolved.
Well, there's more to it than that. Because the concept of arming of troops using that root, I think some people attribute it to the fact that the most basic weapon would be a clenched fist, taking your 5 fingers and putting them together in a clenched fist,
which is 5.
and that's why it came to mean armed. In other words, the term came to mean armed.
Like a fifth. Okay,
and you see it when they leave Egypt, and also you see it under Joshua, that term used. So, but that's etymology.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be. Etymology is not literal.
Right.
Once the meaning is there, then and it's not necessarily always directly related back to the.
Yeah, I mean, his translation doesn't preclude the other. It just doesn't go as deep as that. Because just because he says, because when he says muster the land, that doesn't mean that they didn't do 20% or whatever you're saying. Yeah, but he just doesn't go as deep as that.
Yeah, well, I wondered about that 20%, whether that would even be enough for the 7. Of course, they got huge harvest for those first 7 years, but I think
20% over 7 years would be quite a lot, right? Because every 5 years you have a whole year. But I guess you need 7 years worth, right? So you would only end up with mathematically like 1.4 years, right?
I'm saying it's more.
So that is a little strange.
Yeah. So
because to stretch out 1.4 years worth of food for 7 seems a little much.
I don't think they had 0.
That's true. They didn't have 0.
Very poor harvest, but but I could see where Robert Alter maybe leaned away from the 5th, because maybe he felt the 5th wasn't enough. I don't know.
Well, also, it just may not be that specific, and so why read too much into it?
Right, okay.
Is what I think he said, because he said it's under dispute.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so anyway, well, what's interesting is, like a lot of things in the Bible, you get more information as the story unfolds, because it's well-written literature in addition to being historical fact. It's recounted in an effective way for the audience. So, we didn't get the way that he reacted and all of this, and he's really putting us in his mindset, which I think is really cool.
By the way, the word Joseph itself, may he add, it means in effect increase, and it implies in a way prosperity, and he is the birthright tribe, but here he saves the world, he feeds the world with his solution here.
Oh, yeah, Sean has a good point. He said, this is an instance of Pharaoh recognizing the spirit of God in Joseph. This could be cognitive dissonance regarding the Pharaoh. Yes, because obviously the Pharaoh was thought of as pretty much deified himself, and just in terms of great wisdom. So the idea, again, it's like, and I feel like that's why the narrative did it. I'm going to agree with Rashi. The narrative is trying to say, look, this slave from another tribe is smarter than you. And yes, that's cognitive dissonance. So yeah. I think that's very much what's going on. That would be my take as well.
Okay, I'm going to go now to Genesis.
Especially because Joseph has to set up to Pharaoh, look for a discerning wise man, which is it's almost a little bit rude, because isn't he the discerning wise man? But I think this is something where I disagree with a lot of people, too. A lot of people will say, well, Joseph was so humble, he would never have thought that Pharaoh would do it. I think he's totally leading Pharaoh into leading him into it, because he knows he's capable. And I think people sometimes have a misplaced view of what humility looks like. Humility is not recognizing when God is working with you, when God has blessed you with talent, when you're good at something, because if you're the kind of person that can organize a positive effort and save people's lives, there is nothing about humility that says that you can't try to promote yourself to that job. It has nothing to do with that. That is just an acknowledgement of your skill set.
Reminds me of Isaiah. Here I am, send me.
Right, exactly. So I think he is actually kind of undercutting Pharaoh a little bit when he's like, send out a discerning wise man. He's kind of saying that Pharaoh's not.
Well,
To some extent, he's kind of cutting into him a little bit. They, in a psychological term, he's kind of negging him a little bit because that sets him up for the possibility of him willing to give somebody else that possibility.
well, I would say that Pharaoh himself went to wise men to try to interpret his dream.
Mm-hmm.
A good leader has advisors around him
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't
That's
think.
true. He wasn't so arrogant as to not want the
Yeah,
advice of anybody.
delegating authority is a talent in
Yeah,
itself. You
it
know.
is. Right.
I wanted to go to a verse in Genesis 49 about Judah, who figure a lot in this account as you know already. He's the one that says, "Let's sell him," and later on you'll see he's the one that takes responsibility for Benjamin,
Yep.
and he's the one that gets Joseph to finally break down and reveal
Spoiler
himself.
alert. Come on. We're going to get there
Oh,
later.
okay. I'm sorry. All right. Well, anyway, but regarding Judah, Jacob says of Judah, "Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies." And throughout history, one way the Jews have been preserved is by having some talented individual close to power,
Yes.
who could never really run the country,
Right.
but could be like behind the throne.
Mm-hmm.
We have the case of Mordecai, and although he might have been a Benjamite, but he was at least of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Benjamite, but of that nation of Judah. But we have Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
who is of Judah, and then we have Jews through history
Yep.
that have had that role.
Yep.
Well, Joseph, as an Israel, of course, a descendant of Jacob, an Israelite, but he, in effect, it begins that pattern. Here, he has so much power, he could never become Pharaoh, but he has so much power otherwise, and so because of that, he protects his people. They can come down there, and they have protection, of course, until a new dynasty takes over. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a pattern that we see with Joseph, and later on it's focused particularly on the southern kingdom, on Judah.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah. John had an interesting point where he says, Pharaoh knew Yahweh, which is interesting for me there. Actually, it's that's not the word that Joseph uses. When he says God will answer, that's Elohim, and that's actually very common if you see in the Bible when Jews are speaking to non-Jews. They'll often use Elohim because basically what they're saying is the Elohim is the one, and so it's kind of to put them on similar footing. Now, did Pharaoh think about it from that standpoint as like a god above all other gods? Well, obviously he's giving him the answer. So this might have started a growth. I do believe that there might have been a period of time in Egypt that you might have seen a growth of something like ethical monotheism because of the impact of Joseph. It's very possible. You have a gap obviously where all of that gets lost, but there could have been a period of time that perhaps you saw a growth of ethical monotheism in Egypt because of a result of this miracle. It's very possible.
Yeah, this term is ruach.
I mean, eventually you have a mixed multitude leaving from Egypt, so we don't really know what happened. There could have been ethical monotheists, and maybe they got caught up in the system, and their descendants ended up leaving with the Israelites. There's a lot of things we just don't know.
Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, which you see that term in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to mention that at some point in Egyptian history there was a monotheistic pharaoh, and scholars want to place him prior to Moses, which is I would contend that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
That came after Moses, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Sigmund Freud, he wrote this treatise called Moses and Monotheism, as I recall.
Sigmund Freud, the psychologist.
The psychologist, yeah,
Oh.
and he attributed Akhenaten, he attributed Moses' monotheism to this Egyptian pharaoh, and a movie came out about that back in the 50s. I think quite a popular movie based upon a novel that was very popular at that time. I think it was written by a Finnish author,
Mm-hmm.
but a novel was called The Egyptian, and in that movie they talk about this monotheistic movement. They make quite a big deal about it.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, I think that when all is said and done, it'll be shown that actually was after Moses, not before.
Yeah. And I'm not any sort of ancient Near East expert, but I do know other monotheistic movements. You see pockets of things like that, I believe, throughout history, which is To my dad's point, sometimes people want to say like the Bible's ripping off that concept, which obviously I don't agree with. Sean has a point where in verse 32 it says the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh 2 times. What's up with the two? That is common, right? You have the two witnesses. You need two witnesses in order to settle an argument.
Right, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses when it comes to capital punishment.
Yeah, exactly. So, like the idea, and then two people working together: John the Baptist and Jesus, Elijah and Elisha,
Old Testament,
Aaron,
New Testament.
Old Testament, New Testament, Moses, Aaron. So, yeah, there's this idea that, and it kind of makes sense because, again, if we're going back to cognitive dissonance, we're going back to something scientific, right? You don't just want something to happen once; you want it to repeat at least once, because otherwise, it's like, well, I don't know, that might have just been a random off. You need for something to be a pattern, you usually need at least a single repetition. So I think that's one reason why you see that. But that's a good point.
Although in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it seems there's only the one, but
yeah, I mean, it's not always. I mean, so, like the burning bush doesn't happen multiple things. Although even in that, you have the burning bush, and then his hand has the leprosy, so you kind of have two signs there.
But I want to comment. Joseph says the double dream is the urgency. It's going to happen soon. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar's dream is the far-reaching history of the world. So it's not an urgent matter for Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. All right. Any other comments about this section before we move on and we find out? I do think though there is a funny thing about this scene because it's like the old gag that you always see in like sitcoms and something where somebody's like, we should do this and we should do that and we should do that, and they're like, congratulations, that's now your job. But that's essentially what happened, right? It's like it'll be really difficult, but somehow somebody's got to do it. And like, yep, and that's you. But sometimes that's the way it is. The person that can clearly tell what's going on kind of gets saddled with that responsibility. And to my dad's point, I think one reason why you often see like the wise person and then the person that is kind of really in charge and they just use them as an advisor is because it's two different skill sets. Usually the person who's really in charge is a highly persuasive individual, and to be highly persuasive, you can't be as dogmatic about reality because you have to be willing to concede reality in order to persuade other people. Whereas somebody who's very truthful and very grounded in reality is often not as liked because they'll just tell it like it is. So they often do not rise to power. So the person who rises to power has to like keep their little person who gives them a reality check on the side. But meanwhile, they can compromise a lot more just because of their mindset. I don't know. That's just something I've observed. A little armchair psychology for you. But I mean, it is a pattern in the Bible as well. It's not just, Bible does speak about human nature, and that just seems to be the case. We can't handle the truth, as it were. We usually do not put in leaders that are very grounded in reality. It's just the thing.
Well, it's a talent to be able to assemble a talented team.
Yes.
To support what you're doing.
Yep. Oh yeah, and I don't mean to sound so disparaging on it because there is a sense of it's like perfection is the enemy of the good, right? To be so grounded in reality and so meticulous and maybe pedantic about it is not always the answer either, which is why sometimes you need a more compromising person at the top because they'll be a little more relaxed about getting every little detail right.
Okay.
So, just to give them credit so I don't just beat them up too much. All right, anything else before we move on?
No, we're now going to see the fruit of all this.
Yes, we're going to see the fruit of all this, and we will see you tomorrow.